Hello class. Today we will be looking at some battles from World War I. You'll be able to list technological innovations by the end of the lesson and analyze World War I poetry. So we're going to cover just a few battles just to give you a sense of what this was like. First you had the Battle of Verdun. This is the largest and longest battle on the Western Front between France and Germany. Each side loses 600,000 men. That's over 500,000 men on each side. Then you have the Battle of the Somme. The Somme was the bloodiest battle. One of the bloodiest battles in human history. Over 1 million were killed or injured. The British lost 57,000 men on the first day alone. And this was because the command thought that it would be good for morale if they lined the troops up and had them march calmly and orderly across the field into German machine gun fire, because this is the way battles used to be fought, but that's not how they can be fought now because of the new technology. So again, I said one of the major lessons from World War I would be the disastrous mix of old school strategy and new technology, and the Battle of the Somme is an excellent example of that. So as you recall from last lesson, the conditions in trench warfare were pretty bad. And yet on the Western Front, as bad as this is, the Eastern Front between Russia and Germany and Austria is even worse. It is a meat grinder. The Russians are undersupplied. They're throwing bodies in front of bullets because the one thing they have going for them is that they have a bigger population. The Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottomans are struggling on their end. There will be 15 million deaths on the Eastern Front between Russia, Germany, and Austria. 10 million of those are on the Allied side, so the Russians and the Romanians. There's something called the Brusilov Offensive, the Russo-Turkish campaign. We don't really have time to cover those now, but if you're into military history, you can certainly do some digging on your own. The civilian casualties are also atrocious, but the Eastern Front, the bottom line is, compared to the Western Front, the Eastern Front is so much worse. And the Western Front is truly awful itself. The same will be true when we get to World War II. So the Russians often do not get a lot of acknowledgement in American history classes or British history classes because we tend to focus on the Western Front because that is where we are. And because of the legacy of the Cold War, we don't tend to hold up the contributions of the Russians or the Soviets very much. But it really is. It's very bad on the Eastern Front. And then briefly, we'll just mention the Gallipoli campaign, also known as the Dardanelles campaign. This is where France and Great Britain try and secure a water route to Russia to help supply them. But it doesn't go well. They attack by land and by sea. The Ottomans win. It's very rare that you really truly have a clear victor in battles in World War I because they're often fighting over 30 feet of territory between two trench lines. It tends to go back and forth. One side takes the trench, the other side counters and takes it back. But in this case, there is a clear victor. It is the Ottomans. There's over 500,000 casualties. Winston Churchill, who will eventually become British Prime Minister during World War II, he's a naval officer in this battle. So just again, these historical figures have careers before they become famous. And Winston Churchill was in the Gallipoli campaign. This campaign also sees a lot of troops from Australia and New Zealand fighting because they are British dominions. And after this is when you get Australia and New Zealand demanding to have more of a say in military campaigns and have their own military infrastructure so that they can't just be ordered about by the British. And so in World War II, we'll have what are called Anzac troops, Australia, New Zealand troops that are participating, but they have their own command structure and their own autonomy. Okay, so that's a sampling of battles super quickly. And again, it's a huge disservice to the soldiers in World War I that I had to do that so fast. But there is more information out there if you want to research on your own. Okay, I want you to think about the Industrial Revolution and the new technologies that have been created that might have an effect on war. Because now we're going to look at World War I tech and how it was used. So here we have World War I technology. This is wartime innovations, really technology for the worse here, using it to kill people. So first we're going to look, what is this a picture of? What's going on here? This is gas attacks. This is chemical warfare. So there were some basic gases that were often used. You got tear gas, which can be extremely painful, and in high enough doses can cause real serious damage. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas is probably the one that most people have heard of and associate with World War I. These gas attacks were, they were novel. They were new. At first, they would stick kind of like almost PVC type pipes outside of the trenches and just throw a canister down them and have the wind kind of push it across the field. You might be thinking to yourself, well, what happens if wind changes direction? Well, exactly. And so they learned that lesson the hard way. And so eventually every troop will be equipped with a gas mask, which will protect you against this gas as long as you get it on in time and it doesn't have any rips. If you don't, you will suffocate. It will drown on dry land because your body won't get enough oxygen. It might burn the inside of your lungs. Very painful way to die. The other side, of course, will also equip their soldiers with gas masks. So before long, these attacks are not particularly effective. They will get some soldiers who maybe, were sleeping, didn't get their mask on in time. But they also start launching them like with mortars, so firing them across the trenches instead of just counting on the wind to get them over there. So there's a story here about Einstein and Eddington. So I know you know about Einstein, the guy who created the theory of relativity. He's a German scientist working during World War I. But you probably haven't heard of Eddington. Arthur Eddington was an English scientist. He was in charge of the National Observatory in England, basically just kind of caretaking the observatory and which often just put on displays how amazing Isaac Newton was. Isaac Newton, the guy who came up with the theory of gravity, as you recall. And so Britain, he was a national hero for England, and the idea was that, hey, Newton figured this out and we've got it covered, and all we need to do is just preserve what he figured out. And the problem is that Newton, his theory was accurate except for Mercury. It constantly got Mercury's orbit wrong, and you always had to correct for Mercury. And so the British just got used to being like, well, okay, that's just what we have to do. But Einstein starts thinking about, hey, maybe there's something more to this, and he comes up with this new theory about how big objects kind of warp the fabric of space around them, and that's why, if you picture it like one of those big funnels that you can put a penny down and it like circles around the drain, that's sort of what he's talking about. And so Arthur Eddington in England hears about this, and he starts trying to write letters back and forth to Einstein about this new theory because he's curious and he's a scientist, and even though it's challenging a British hero, he wants to know more. And this is during World War I, and this is when these enemies are fighting. These two countries are enemies. You saw the nationalistic children's poems that people had been taught between Germany and Britain. And the governments are furious at them. They're trying to censor the mail between them. It doesn't help that Eddington himself is a Quaker, so he's a pacifist. He refuses to fight in the war. And so he's already being accused of being disloyal and being a coward for these convictions that he has about not fighting. So anyway, eventually their correspondence leads them to, after the war, Eddington will go down to South Africa, a British colony, and during an eclipse, and he'll be able to measure the position of the stars behind the sun because of the eclipse. He'll actually be able to see them, and he will prove Einstein's theory correct. So without Eddington, you might not know Einstein, because Eddington's the guy who actually proves this theory. Much like Copernicus and Brahe. People know Copernicus, they often, or Kepler, and they don't often know Brahe. And so the reason I mention that here is because Eddington he was gay, and so the man he was in love with was actually drafted into the war, and he was put on the front lines at in a town called Ypres in Belgium, and it was one of the early examples of instances of a gas attack, and he died. So that's my tie-in for science and chemical warfare. Right. Okay, so in addition to chemical warfare, we have flamethrowers, right, which could be useful for, burning the people in the enemy trench. Would you want this? Would you want to be the guy who has the flamethrower? Hopefully you answered no, because the danger here is that you are carrying, liquid fuel on your back. So if you get shot, this whole thing can explode in a ball of flame. Okay. Snipers. Snipers are going to be important in this war and in the next war and in many to come. But snipers were considered a dishonorable job, like a necessary but dishonorable job, because you're shooting at people who don't know that you're there. So they would, armies would often disband their sniper corps between wars, but then reinstate them because, again, they are useful in a military situation. They're named after a tiny bird in India where British hunters would display how great a shot they were by being able to hunt snipe, and they were called snipers because it's such a small target. The Germans come up with this contraption that's supposed to look kind of like a tree, and you can see there are little holes in it, so you would get in this thing. It would have little foot pedals at the bottom, so you could march yourself across no man's land, but you'd look like a tree, so at night it would be hard to tell you were there. And then you would use this little hole to shoot at the enemy. When the British see that this is happening, they write home to their families to send their elephant guns. Now, why would British soldiers have had elephant guns back at home? Well, because they have colonies in Africa and in India. So the elephant guns are designed to pierce very thick hide, and of course it pierces this, and so this German contraption winds up not being very useful for very long. But again, an example of how imperialism and colonialism are tying into the shape of this war. Why do soldiers wear helmets? Not to stop a direct shot. It's not thick enough to stop a direct shot to your head, but it will stop shrapnel. It will stop bits from mortars or rocks that are being sent into the air because of explosions. It will stop a ricochet. So if a bullet hits something and ricochets, that the bullet will now have been slowed down enough that the helmet will stop it. So that is why you wear a helmet. Watches. Watches were worn by wealthy women as jewelry before World War I, but now you need orchestrated, precise, timed movements. And so it actually becomes very necessary for soldiers to have watches, and then businesses realize, hey, we can market these as a standard piece for not just wealthy women, but for everybody after the war. And it's a manly thing to have because of the war. Tanks. Tanks are going to be your game changer. We obviously had cars and jeeps, but why is a car or a jeep not good on a World War I battlefield? Well, any of you that have started driver's ed will hopefully have been instructed that it's very important not to run into a ditch, because if you run into a ditch, it's going to be hard to get your car out of that ditch. And all the trenches are ditches. But tanks with these treads, they can basically pull themselves out of the ditches. They're also wide enough that they might be able to just roll right over a trench. So tanks are going to be the reason we don't see trench warfare used in World War II, because tanks make them obsolete. Planes. Planes are going to be used as first reconnaissance vehicles. So you will fly over the enemy territory just to recon where's the artillery, where are the troop movements, what's it look like, how deep are their trenches, how far back do they go. But it doesn't take long before somebody brings up a handgun and starts shooting at the other side's recon planes, and then they bring up a rifle, and then somebody straps a machine gun to the wing, and before you know it, you have what are called dog fights in the air between these planes. The most famous dogfighter was a German pilot called the Red Baron. He's the guy that Snoopy's always fighting if you watch the Peanuts or read the Peanuts. But I do not know why there is a pizza named after him. I really have no idea, but that's the reference. The Red Baron, you can see he's a pilot here. Okay. And then we have submarines. Submarines started to be invented during the U.S. Civil War, but they didn't really work. And now people have managed to get working submarines. And Germans don't have a big army, a big navy. The British do. They have the biggest navy on the planet. But the Germans are investing in submarine warfare to help them combat that navy and to try and stop the British from getting supplies from their colonies, because Britain, again, is an island. So they will shoot at British ships coming in, and they will adopt, the Germans will adopt what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, which means they will shoot not just at military Navy ships, but at merchant ships as well that are carrying supplies. Because the British will start putting war supplies onto merchant ships, but those merchant ships are civilian vessels, and they often have civilian passengers on them. And so the question becomes, well, is that fair? Can you target a ship that has civilians on it if it has war supplies on it? And the Geneva Conventions would say no. You have to try and minimize civilian damage. But for the Germans at this time, it seems unfair that the British are using those civilian ships to smuggle in war supplies. A ship that will be sunk will have a few Americans on it, called the Lusitania, and this will get the Americans very angry, and they will tell the Germans to stop this, to knock it off, or they'll join the war. And so the Germans will cut it out for a couple years, and then they'll get desperate and they'll start doing it again, and we'll talk a bit more about that in our next lesson. So that is it for the major new technological innovations. Of course, we also have telegraphs and cars and things like that. It was actually fascinating that some people thought war wasn't going to happen because it would cause such a disruption to trade and train lines and telegrams, but it did happen. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at two poems, and I'm going to have you analyze these poems. These are both written by World War I soldiers, and they're both written by English-speaking World War I soldiers. So the first one is called In Flanders Fields. It's by John McCrae. He was a Canadian Army doctor, and he wrote this in 1915 after burying a friend of his who was killed in the Battle of Ypres. So when you listen to this poem, it's going to first of all reference Flanders, which is in Belgium. So that is where, again, his friend died, and John McCrae buried his friend. It's going to reference the flower, the poppy. You'll see it. It's a red flower. This poppy is something that should be familiar to you. We've talked about poppies before. It's also worn by people in Britain, in British Dominion countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., to mark the end of World War I, known as Armistice Day, every year after. In the United States, this is called Veterans Day, but it's the same day, November 11th, and so they will always wear this, and it's the references from this poem. So while you listen to this poem, I want you to think, what is the tone of the poem? Is it happy, sad, mournful, depressing, joyful? What is the tone? Whose perspective is it told from? Right? Who is saying these words? And finally, what is the message? What is it asking the audience to do? Right? So here we go.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place.
Okay, so what is the tone of this poem? It's pretty sad, mournful, and yet, whose perspective would you say it is told from? It's told from the perspective of the dead soldiers, right? So we once lived, felt sunset glow, but here we lie in Flanders Fields, right? So the quote about the birds flying, but they can't be heard below because of all the artillery fire, right? So it's a mournful, it's sort of peaceful in a way, but mournful and told from the perspective of the dead. So what are the dead asking people to do? What are they asking the audience to do? What is the message here? Right. The message is that they need to keep fighting. And you might expect the dead to tell you to stop fighting because they died and they wouldn't want you to die too. But the message here from John McCrae towards the beginning of this war in May 1915, they've been fighting for not even a year yet, is that, hey, we better win this to make all of this worth it so that these soldiers haven't died in vain. Right? Now that's from 1915. Like I said, less than a year into this war. Next, we're going to look at a poem by a man named Wilfred Owen. He is considered by many to be the greatest poet of World War I. Served in the British military. And he wrote this poem sometime between October of 1917 and March of 1918. So towards the end of this war, the war won't end until November of 1918. November 11th of 1918 is when armistice will be declared to cease fire. So I want you to think as we go through this, how does the tone of the poem compare to the other one? What is this poem's message? Right? Okay, and the poem references a Latin phrase, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which translates to, it is sweet and right to die for your country. Remember, it is sweet and right to die for your country. This was something that was being taught to young boys from the time they were very little, and helped gear them up for what would eventually become World War I. So this is what I want you to think. Again, what's the tone and what is the message?
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, death even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes of thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood cup gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores of innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
Okay, so how does the tone of this one compare to the tone of the other poem? Right, this is a lot darker. This is a lot more resentful, a lot more graphic. Why do you think there's this change between the two poems when you consider the dates that the poems were written? Wilfred Owen's been in this war a lot longer. It's been maybe 3.5 years at this point that they've been fighting. He's seen how many people die for what seems to be now useless deaths. There's not any great gains of territory. There doesn't seem to be this glory. It's misery in trenches, in the mud. And they've lost this idea that, yeah, we're gonna win this war. We're gonna beat the enemy. Everybody just is miserable at this point. What's the poem's message? It's quite different than the last one. This is, hey, cut it out. Stop telling little boys that they should sign up for the war to go get their glory and their awesome battle scars and that they'll be home and come home as heroes. That there's nothing better than dying for your country. That's what makes a true hero. Stop, because that's what got us into this war. What is that an example of? Yeah, that's militarism, right? The glorification of the military. And this is where it got them in this 4-year-long, catastrophic, devastating war. If you consider that the end of World War I is November 11th, 1918, look at when Wilfred Owen dies. What does that tell you about his death? Right, he probably died in battle a mere week before the end of the war. And he is what we would call part of the lost generation, an entire generation of poets and artists that disappeared. And really you can apply that to the broader loss of life of this particular age group of young men. But it's also often used to refer specifically to the lost artists and poets and writers of this era. So that will finish our lesson for today. Next time we will look at the end of World War I and the long-lasting ramifications. How does it end and what does that mean for Europe going forward?